What's going on? What's crack-a-lackin', my peoples? How you doing? I'm Jerry Quickley. This is happening. You know what's going on. It's that time. We're about to unpack all the recent machinations of the Trump administration, all their dullness, all their obviousness. It's so incredibly dull. He's just a common thief. How much more dull can you be? Well, here today to discuss some of the new goings-on, including Michael Flynn running from the courthouse with his tail between his legs yesterday so he wasn't going to get a jail sentence because Emmett Sullivan, the judge, made very clear, sir, if you demand I sentence you today, you will not like the outcome. You have Jared Kushner is clearly in the crosshairs, as is Ivanka Trump, as is Donald Jr., probably Eric too. I think maybe Tiffany escaped and Barron escaped, but the rest of his family is going to jail, potentially. Joining us today to discuss all that and more, Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative journalist and author David Cay Johnston. David, how are you? Welcome back to This Is Happening.
Well, glad to be here.
So let's start if we just it's hard to even pick a place. It's such a fire hose. Let's start with Michael Cohen's pleading and the unique problems that represents and challenges that represents to the Trump administration.
Well, we have this is absolutely astonishing what's happened here. We have the man who was the national security advisor to the President of the United States, who President Obama warned Donald Trump to stay away from, admit that he was acting as a foreign agent. I mean, try to imagine what would happen if under Obama or even George W. Bush this had happened, and why the Republicans continue to try and excuse this and explain it away. I was watching Fox News yesterday trying to explain this all away, and these ridiculous claims that General Flynn was entrapped, and Sarah Huckabee Sanders saying today that, they didn't follow normal protocol and they ambushed him. This guy is a 33-year military veteran. He doesn't know you don't lie to the FBI. But more importantly, he was a paid agent of two foreign governments. And so this is extremely disturbing. And what's even more disturbing is that while Donald Trump is going around denouncing his long-time, more than 10-year lawyer and fixer, Michael Cohen, he continues to speak well of General Flynn, who's confessed to similar and frankly much more serious crimes, which suggests that, Americans overall, our hair should be on fire about national security, so long as Donald Trump is in the White House. It
strikes me that there was something unusual in how Mueller chose to move forward with the sentencing of Flynn to begin with, because usually, whether it's a U.S. attorney or whether it's a special prosecutor, they will withhold the sentencing of the person until the case is essentially resolved to make sure that they can compel their full cooperation. And with Donald Trump, so that's one component of it. Another component,
Jerry, let me address that, because I think that's a very good point, and I think most of the commentary and news reports in this have kind of missed a little bit what's going on here. You're exactly right that normally you hold off sentencing somebody like this if there's going to be a witness. It's very important to recognize that the paperwork filed in this case, the briefs on sentencing, the pre-sentencing reports, and the briefs by both the Mueller's team and by the Justice Department, and by General Flynn, were heavily redacted. The judge in this case, who has a long reputation for being pretty strict about compliance with the law, both civilly and criminal, the judge in this case saw the unredacted materials. And we don't know what he's seen that we haven't seen, but when he raises the question of whether there was traitorous conduct, you can't literally commit treason right now because we are not in a state of war declared by Congress. But traitorous conduct, disloyal conduct, is raised by the judge, strongly suggests that in those materials the judge has seen, but we have not, and in some cases Flynn may not have seen for national security reasons, there is something more disturbing than what has so far come out. And you'll notice the judge basically threw this back and gave them some delay because my reading of this is there's something more Flynn hasn't quite, for all of his cooperation in the 19 meetings and 60 some hours of interviews, there's more here that he has not been forthcoming about, and the judge is aware of it, and he's basically said, you go drain this guy until there's no more blood to
until he taps out, right?
Yeah, until he taps out.
It's ordinarily because Mueller has been he's had such like deep like Buddha concentration and focus on maintaining strict silence and keeping the investigation properly aligned and focused where it should be, that the sentencing or the postponed sentencing of Michael Flynn yesterday struck me as being either a rare misstep or, more likely, that there's something else that's being uncovered in how Mueller has chosen to go about this administrative component of sentencing. Because it's a wordy way of saying Mueller strikes me as too smart to let Flynn off the hook without some type of a larger plan, or is my imagination just becoming too baroque?
Well, I think it may well be that they had come to an impasse and they'd gotten enough. Remember, the job of a prosecutor is not to prove everything and have a perfect case. It's to put together a case you can win to establish criminal conduct or other misconduct. And it may well be that they felt that, they had squeezed Flynn and that he wasn't going to move another step. And if there's something more there to get out of Flynn, the judge has sent a very clear signal. If you want to avoid jail or get a minimal jail term, General, then you're going to give up every last drop of knowledge. And, Mueller's office, Flynn is, a part of this story, but let's be clear, the target of this is and always has been Donald Trump, primarily, and secondarily the family around him, and then third are the members of the entourage like Mike Flynn and Cohen.
I want to remind my listeners that my guest is Mr. David Cay Johnston. David is an investigative journalist, a Pulitzer Prize winner, and the author of the New York Times bestseller, It's Even Worse Than You Think, What the Trump Administration is Doing to America. Right now, Donald Trump is under 17 different investigations. Right. Every organization that he has been a part of in the last 10 years is under active criminal investigation. There are also active civil investigations happening. And you have everyone who was in business with him has a seat at the table with Mueller. They're all rolling on Trump. They're all giving him up, with the exception of Roger Stone for now, whatever. But the point is that the vast majority of the folks that Donald Trump may have been or is alleged to have been involved in this broad spectrum of felony behavior with, they are all rolling and turning on Trump. You combine that with the fact that Donald Trump has never in his life had a reckoning for his illegal behavior, his criminal behavior, his uncivil behavior, and you have something of a perfect storm because everyone's got a place at the table, right? Everyone's getting some milk except for Trump, and he has no one to trade. Where is this going, David?
And that's what he's always done in the past. Donald beat 4 federal grand juries in his 30s by ratting out other people or running out the clock. And he's never been held to account. The New Jersey Casino Control Commission was very careful, or the Division of Gaming Enforcement in the State Attorney General's office, to never ask Trump a question that would force them to revoke his license after they, improperly in my view and without reason, granted him a casino license. I mean, Australia found that he was too mobbed up to get a license, and many other jurisdictions said, no, we're not going to license you. In one way or another, and some of them they just signaled it so that there was no formal finding. And now Trump can't do that, and this is not the environment he's used to. In the 30 years I've known Donald, I've often thought about how this is a man who has these delusions, what a psychiatrist would call delusions of grandeur. He really believes that he is the superior human being, that he is smarter than everybody else, and of course he should be running America. In fact, he should run the whole world. And if you don't appreciate that, well, fake news and you're a fool.
Wow.
The problem with that is, of course, he isn't just a drunk in a bar. He's the president of the United States. So it's a little hard to argue that he's being delusional about that,
right?
Given where he's gotten to be. But Donald's trapped now. He's cornered, and he's got private organizations like Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics in Washington coming after him, led by former ethics chief lawyers for the Obama and George W. Bush administrations. He's got the attorney generals of New York, Maryland, and the District of Columbia coming after him on the emoluments clause, and a number of other attorney generals on other fronts. And he's got rats deserting the sinking ship. So what you have here is a mob boss, and that's what Donald Trump is. He's the third generation head of a white-collar crime family. They don't break your legs. They break your bank account using pens and threats and legal strategy and refusing to pay you what you're owed. And he's cornered now. And this is a very dangerous time for America because Donald doesn't have a moral core to fall back on. He doesn't see himself as anything except, this great person who's charitable and smarter than everybody else. And we should be very worried about what's going to happen. The intemperate action announced today that against the advice of his generals, and Trump during the campaign said he was going to listen to his generals, even though he said he knew more about ISIS than the American General Officer Corps, to withdraw from Syria, just abruptly withdraw against the advice of our leading military officers, and now a number of Republicans like Lindsey Graham are stepping up to the plate finally about something. Whether we should have been in Syria in the first place is a whole other issue, but once you're in, you got to act thoughtfully about what you're doing here. And he's just a bull in a china shop. He has no idea what he's doing. And for the whole country and the whole world, this is going to be a dangerous time so long as he remains in office.
I want to remind my listeners that my guest is Mr. David Cay Johnston. David is an investigative journalist, a Pulitzer Prize winner, and the author of the New York Times bestseller, It's Even Worse Than You Think: What the Trump Administration is Doing to America. David, I want to posit a theory I have about Trump and the Russians, and I blame entirely, I lay the blame for Trump's involvement with Russia at the feet of Rudy Giuliani. Give me just about 30 seconds to unpack my take on it. The reason I lay this at the feet of Rudy Giuliani is that the Trump family is a crime family, have been multi-generation transnational crime family. They were completely and are completely mobbed up. They were money launderers for the Genovese crime family for decades, decade after decade after decade. Money laundering,
and the Gambinos as well.
Right, Genovese and Gambino crime families. They were the one of the go-to money launderers in New York City. Rudy Giuliani in the 1980s had some successful RICO prosecutions of organized crime in New York, including the Gambino and Genovese families. He weakened those families to such a great extent that it literally created a moment that allowed someone named Semyon Mogilevich, who was a Russian-born gangster. He's essentially capo di tutti capo of all the Russian mobsters. And Semyon Mogilevich and the Russian mob rolled into New York, rolled up all of the Genovese assets, including the Trump family, and that put Donald Trump squarely in the pocket of the Russian mob. Thanks, Rudy. Am I a crazy hippie on the pipe, or is there any truth to that?
Well, I don't think that was Rudy's intent, but the underlying facts are absolutely correct. After Donald, was out crazily spending money and way overpaying for everything, the supposed great negotiator who overpaid for everything from the yacht to the Plaza Hotel, and couldn't pay back his debts. And Donald and I had a conversation one day in 1990 where I said, "So how much are you worth, Donald?" And he goes, $3 billion. And I said, "I don't believe you." And he says, "What do you mean you don't believe me?" And I said, "Donald, you can't pay your bills. You got all these people I'm talking to, all these vendors, they're not getting paid. You don't know anything about finance." And I said, "Donald, if you actually had $3 billion, you could sell or borrow against something, and it might be painful, but you could pay your bills, and you can't pay your bills, so I don't believe you." Later that day, by the way, he told a ABC network correspondent he was worth $5 billion, which further confirms he was just making this stuff up.
Right.
So the banks, except for Deutsche Bank, the preferred bank for Russian money launderers, stopped loaning money to him, even secured by real estate. They would not loan him money. And suddenly Donald has lots of money. And we know this money came from the Russians. The Trumps themselves have said so. Now, Giuliani didn't do the prosecutions for the purpose of setting up Simeon Meglovich. I'm probably mispronouncing his name. I'm not good at Russian names. But the reality of what happened is exactly right. Donald found a new source of money, and it was after the collapse of the Soviet Empire, as Ronald Reagan called it. Russians the wealth of the Soviet peoples was stolen and turned over to these people we call the oligarchs. And they needed to park money. They needed to get money out of Russia to protect themselves from, kleptocrats who would come along in the future. And Donald Trump was one of their most preferred vehicles for doing so. And unfortunately, law enforcement didn't do its job back then of nailing him. There is also, Jerry, a theory. I'm not necessarily subscribing to it, but I've always thought it was a very interesting theory about Rudy Giuliani. Rudy's father was a criminal. He spent time in Sing Sing prison for armed robbery as Wayne Barrett, the first journalist to get on to Donald Trump and cover him seriously. I was the second after Wayne. Revealed a long time ago. And there are some people in New York who argue that Rudy was doing the same thing that a vice cop who's shutting down whorehouses, but whose girlfriend or he himself is directly in the whorehouse business is doing, shutting down the competition, that Rudy was really carrying water for some other organized crime elements. And his bizarre behavior now that Trump is president certainly raises questions about, what exactly he was doing back in those days.
Wow, that I was being somewhat facetious when I laid this at the feet of Rudy. I mean, certainly I do lay it at his feet because his actions did result in it, but it wasn't his plan to do it. But you do open up.
But once the relationship with the criminals that we know goes back to at least soon after the war, and I suspect goes all the way back to Trump's grandfather, but I can't prove that. But certainly is well ingrained in Donald Trump's life from the moment he became sentient. Absolutely, he had to shift away from the traditional Italian mafia families in New York to other gangsters. And remember, Donald hasn't just done business with the Brighton Beach crowd of Russian mobsters who have been treated very interestingly by our federal government. He's done business with Irish mobsters, Kazakh mobsters, all sorts of mobsters around the world. And basically, criminals understood, white criminals who had money to launder and money to hide, that Donald Trump was a place to go to facilitate that. Not the only place by far, but one they could do business with. Trump Tower is well known to law enforcement because it is full of people who are organized criminal figures currently, or they're on the lam, or they're kleptocrats from foreign countries. And yet, Trump presses complete innocence about this. There was a full-blown casino that took up the entire floor directly below Donald's 3-story apartment that ran for several years till the FBI shut it down. And when that happened, Donald's response was effectively, there's gambling going on in Trump Tower? I had no idea. Wow. Really? How could you not have known, given the security features of that building and how you get access to it?
Right, that you were running a casino on 3 floors. Right. Wow.
Right. I mean, the only reason he could argue he didn't know is because, he was what the law calls willfully blind.
Yeah, right. Willful ignorance is not the same thing as not knowing.
That's right.
David, there are so many investigations, as I briefly touch on, 17 different investigations in Donald Trump. The Trump campaign is under investigation. The Trump transition team is under investigation. The Trump the Trump administration is under investigation. The Trump organization is under investigation. The Trump Foundation is under investigation. And there are 17 in total, not least of which is the fact that Trump is a criminal world-class tax cheat who had stolen, according to the New York Times investigation, over $400 million from the state of New York alone. While it may be too late to prosecute him criminally, I suspect that New York State is going to come after him for that cash.
Well, one hopes so. The New York Times, very generously, where I was a reporter, has publicly said the reason they undertook this massive investigation was a story that I did in March of 2017, where I got 2 pages of Donald's tax return, which I believe Donald sent to me. They suddenly realized that, it could be kind of embarrassing if their retired reporter were to come up with all this stuff. Of course, I didn't have the resources as a retiree to do what they did, and that is the most fantastic investigative piece, the most thorough and precise I have ever read in my life. And I've been doing this now since 1967.
What did they reveal? Because a lot of folks who are investigative journalists don't have a background in taxes or accounting. What is the summary that was so startling and earth-shaking about the Times revelations?
Well, the Trump family engaged in outright fraud. And they did so by a variety of means that mispriced things. So they would tell the government when transferring real estate from Fred Trump and his wife to the children that a building was worth X, and then they would list it to bankers as being worth 10X. There's a range of values. Your house is worth roughly so much. But if you put down that it's worth 5 cents on the dollar in a transfer, that's criminal. Mm-hmm. And they didn't do this once. They did it again and again and again. And they had an invoicing scheme where Fred Trump would buy stoves and other appliances for Trump apartments, and they would be passed through the children through an entity called All County that would mark them up 20 to 50%. And it was just a way to not only transfer money to the children and rip off the tax system, but it justified raising rents in rent-controlled and rent-stabilized apartments, many of which many Trump buildings fall under those 2 laws in New York City. All of these, not all, but many of these devices had to do with what's called the time value of money. $1,000 in your pocket today is worth less than $1,000 10 years from now. A tax you pay 10 years from now, $1,000, doesn't cost you as much as a tax you would pay today of $1,000, and you make money off of that difference. And they, if you looked at their tax returns, all the numbers add up. They were superficially correct. The problem is that behind them, the books and records would show massive cheating. And there's a reason that the IRS would not be particularly vigilant in going after them. Imagine, Jerry, that you're an IRS auditor and you get Trump's tax return, and you go over it and you say, wait a minute, you show a negative income of $10 million and you're really only entitled to a negative income of $1 million. And you go tooth and nail and want to fight this. And your bosses are going to say the government's not going to get a penny out of this today. And you say, yeah, but in the future, he's going to use that negative income of $9 million
to steal.
To steal in the future. And they go, well, that's in the future. This is this audit now. And so this happens with real estate families all the time, not on the scale of the Trumps, but, they take valuations that are favorable. The Trumps went way past that line, and the New York Times quite properly, and I assure you, having been through the editing maw of the New York Times on investigative pieces many times, this was not done without very solid proof and absolute confidence by every editor involved, called what the Trumps did outright fraud.
David, I'm sorry.
Words. There's no fuzzy language. Maybe this was improper. They called it outright fraud.
I want to remind my listeners that my guest is Mr. David Cay Johnston. David is an investigative journalist, a Pulitzer Prize winner, and the author of the New York Times bestseller, It's Even Worse Than You Think, What the Trump Administration is Doing to America. David, given that part of our discussion and what the Trumps have done, I don't want to pull you from your area of expertise, but there's most assuredly, even if it's only a relationship of happy circumstance, there's most assuredly a relationship between the Republican insistence on essentially defunding the Internal Revenue Service and what wealthy scum like Trump are able to get away with in the wake of a weakened and somewhat anemic IRS in terms of their resources and abilities to go after the super elites for pulling scams like this.
Well, I mean, remember, I wrote a best-selling book about this that's still in print 15 years later called Perfectly Legal. And this is a lot of what I exposed when the 13 years I was at the New York Times investigating our tax system. We have taken the IRS and turned it into essentially an extremely efficient system to collect taxes from wage earners. But if you are a landlord, a business owner who's in control of the business, now I'm not talking about executives of companies, a business owner, and if you're an international business person who runs your own show, you tell the government what you say is your income. And unless you're audited, that stands. And if they don't audit you, generally within 3 years, you get away with your cheating. And the IRS actually told Congress in a report about, I think, 6 years ago now, that there were something I had been arguing for a long time, that there are so many sophisticated Wall Street products and accounting devices to make it difficult to value transactions that they did not have the capacity to do their job. And the Republicans keep cutting the budget of the IRS. And there's a wonderful project that came out this last week at, I think it was ProPublica, about what happened to the IRS, and it's been just denuded. I mean, it is the functional equivalent of the mayor in your city ordering the police department to shut down the squads that investigate murders, rapes, and armed robberies and focus on tricycle thefts. I mean, it's really that bad. Yeah, it was Jesse Eisinger's series in ProPublica called How the IRS Was Gutted. And it's a brilliant project about how you make this law enforcement agency ineffective for everybody who doesn't have what's called verified income. If you're a worker who gets a paycheck, or even a gig employee who gets 1099 forms at the end of the year, or you're a pensioner who gets an annuity, your income is all reported independently of you to the government. But if you're in business for yourself, if you're Donald Trump, you report, and we just don't police those people anymore. We don't have the resources to do it, and it is one of the biggest crimes in this country. You would be able to pay lower taxes, less in taxes, if we stopped this nonsense at the top and allowed people to both legally avoid through laws that we should adjust and criminally evade, as the Trumps have done, their obligations to support our government.
David, before we lose you, there's just 17 investigations. It's hard cramming them all into a 30-minute interview. Right now, at this particular moment, you have Trump essentially decompensating. Did an interview with Dr. Bandy Lee of Yale Medical School, and she and other physicians are very much of the opinion that there are organic impairments that are taking place, and that these impairments are too significant and could potentially contain the seeds of too much catastrophe for doctors not to speak out at all and act as though everything's fine when it's not. Yeah. Given his decompensation, given that he is now feeling more and more cornered, that he's never had to deal with a reckoning, I ask the obvious, which is, in the absence of removing Trump from office, what good place does this go?
Well, there's no prospect that he will be removed by impeachment based on current conditions. You take 67 votes in the Senate to convict, and they just don't exist. There's just no possibility. So impeaching him would be a tremendous political mistake, because it would embolden him and strengthen the people who believe that he's a demigod rather than a demagogue. I favor, rather than psychiatric analysis of him, the and it's in my biography of Trump, The Making of Donald Trump, using the Army Field Manual standards for promoting officers, because anybody should be able to understand these. And Trump fails all 6 tests there for being promoted as an officer. Do you take responsibility? Do you know what you're doing? Do you listen to advice? Do you keep your options open, et cetera? And Trump fails every one of these. And Donald clearly is not as sharp as he was back then. There's no question that he has. I'm not as sharp as I was, and we're about the same age, 30 years ago when I first met him. But he's deteriorated a lot, and that should be of great concern to us. On the other hand, remember that if Trump were to be removed through impeachment, that means we get President Mike Pence, a man who believes God put him there, and who believes that the government, should control women's bodies and lots of other stuff, and who presided over a state where there was massive corruption in handing out money for economic development. There was a TV station in Indianapolis that, after a long fight, finally got the records on millions and millions, hundreds of millions of dollars that were given for job development. They got in a truck with the cameras and they went to the locations, and the first one they went to, where I think it was close to $100 million, was given to the developers to create 1,500 jobs. It was an abandoned barn.
Wow.
Pence would never have been reelected in Indiana, and why he hasn't been prosecuted or people around him prosecuted is one of the great mysteries. But of course, Obama was not big on prosecuting people. He didn't go after a single banker. They wouldn't talk to Bill Black, the guy who got over 3,000 indictments in the savings and loan scandal of the late 80s, early 90s, and more than 800 senior bank executives sent to prison. So, there's a real problem with not enforcing the laws in this country, and Donald Trump has been the huge beneficiary of it. Now we're finally seeing an incredibly competent team of prosecutors led by Robert Mueller, who are on to Trump, who know vastly more than we do, Jerry. We're just seeing little slivers of this in the public record.
Right.
And who are going to build a case. And the question is, are the 40% of Americans who can, something like 75% of Republicans believe Donald Trump in surveys, they say they believe he's an honest man.
Wow.
When are they going to open their eyes and, see what is right in front of them? When are they going to cease to be willfully blind? And then are we as a country going to recognize that we need to be serious about our government, that, as Thomas Jefferson taught, your first duty is to be an engaged citizen?
Well, my guest for this segment has been Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative journalist and author David Cay Johnston. His most recent book is It's Even Worse Than You Think, What the Trump Administration is Doing to America. And I'm so happy that you're able to join us today. David, thank you so much for shedding light on this ever-evolving constitutional crisis.
Jerry, thank you. And when my next book comes out, which proposes an entirely new federal tax system, probably be out in 2020, I hope you have me back.
I absolutely will. I can't wait to have that discussion with you. Thanks so much, David.
Bye-bye.
Thanks so much, David.
Bye-bye.
Thanks so much, David.